His calloused hands steadied her trembling wheelchair as grocery bags tumbled to the wet pavement. But it was the small voice from inside the taxi, soft, hopeful, breaking, that stopped his heart. "Thank you, Daddy." The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and shimmering under the orange glow of streetlights. Frank Stone wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, the smell of grease and coffee still clinging to his work uniform. Another double shift at the diner, another day of aching feet and forced smiles. Another evening where he'd come home too late to tuck his 7-year-old son Oliver into bed. But this was the life he'd chosen, or rather the life that had chosen him after his wife passed 3 years ago. Grief had a way of reshaping everything, carving out new routines from the rubble of old dreams. Now it was just him and Oliver, navigating the world with mismatched socks and burnt toast, held together by a love that was fierce and fragile all at once. Frank pulled his jacket tighter against the evening chill as he walked through the grocery store parking lot toward the bus stop. His shift had run late, again, and the last bus would be here in 10 minutes. He was calculating whether he had enough energy to read Oliver a bedtime story over the phone when he heard it. A soft, frustrated sound, almost like a whimper. He turned. Beneath the flickering light of a parking lamp, a woman sat in a wheelchair, her face flushed with effort and embarrassment. Her hands gripped the wheels, trying to propel herself forward, but the chair seemed stuck. Plastic grocery bags hung precariously from the handles, their contents threatening to spill. One bag had already given up. Its contents, a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, a small stuffed bear, scattered across the wet asphalt. A yellow taxi idled a few feet away, its driver scrolling through his phone, oblivious or indifferent. Frank's feet moved before his mind caught up. "Hey, let me help you with that," he called out, his voice gentle, non-threatening. The woman's head snapped up, her dark eyes wide with surprise and something else. Shame, maybe, or the exhaustion of someone who'd learned to expect nothing from the world. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with long black hair pulled into a messy ponytail. Her clothes were clean but worn, the kind of worn that spoke of careful washing and stubborn hope. Her wheelchair was old, one wheel slightly bent, the metal frame spotted with rust. "Your wheel's stuck," he observed, noticing how the bent wheel had caught on a crack in the pavement. "It does that," the woman murmured, her voice barely audible. "I just need to... Here, let me." Frank moved behind the wheelchair, his hands finding the handles. He lifted slightly, angling the chair to free the jammed wheel, then gently pushed her toward the waiting taxi. The woman didn't resist this time, just sat rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The taxi driver finally looked up, popping the trunk with visible annoyance. Frank loaded the groceries carefully, making sure nothing would shift or spill during the ride. Then he moved back to help the woman transfer into the taxi. She was already trying to stand, using the car door for support, but her legs buckled immediately. Frank caught her elbow, steadying her with the practiced ease of someone who understood fragility. "I've got you," he said quietly. "Take your time." Her breathing was labored, her face twisted in pain she was trying to hide. Frank supported her weight as she maneuvered herself into the back seat, her movements stiff and careful. He could feel how much it cost her, not just physically, but emotionally, to accept this help from a stranger. When she was finally settled, Frank folded the wheelchair and lifted it into the trunk, ignoring the driver's impatient sigh. Then he closed the back door gently, relief washing over him. Good deed done. He could still catch his bus. But as he stepped back, a small face appeared in the taxi window. A little girl. No more than 4 or 5 years old, with enormous brown eyes and hair tied up in lopsided pigtails. She was clutching the stuffed bear Frank had rescued, pressing it against the glass as she looked up at him with an expression of pure, devastating wonder. And then she smiled, a gap-toothed, radiant smile, and pressed her tiny palm against the window. "Thank you, Daddy." The words were muffled by the glass, but Frank heard them as clearly as if she had shouted them. They hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. His hand froze on the taxi door, his vision blurring at the edges. "Daddy." Inside the cab, the woman's face went pale. "Lily, no, sweetie, that's not—" She turned to Frank, her eyes swimming with mortification. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. She calls every man who's kind to us that. I've tried to explain, but she doesn't understand." The little girl, Lily, looked confused now, her smile faltering as she sensed her mother's distress. Frank found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "It's okay." "It's not okay," the woman said, her voice breaking. "You were just helping us, and now you probably think we're— I don't know what you think, but—" She took a shaky breath. "Her father left before she was born. She's never had— She doesn't know what it means to have a daddy, so she calls everyone that. Every man who holds a door or smiles at her or—" Her voice cracked completely. "I'm sorry. We'll go now." She reached forward to tap the driver's shoulder, but Frank heard himself say, "Wait. Have you ever had a moment where a stranger's simple kindness moved you to tears? What would you have done in Frank's shoes? Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your story." The woman froze, her hands suspended in midair. Frank looked at Lily, who was still watching him with those impossibly hopeful eyes, and then at her mother, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the taxi seat. He thought of Oliver, safe at home with Mrs. Patterson from next door. He thought of how Oliver used to cry for his mother in the middle of the night, how he still sometimes asked when Mommy was coming home, even though he understood she never would. He thought about loneliness and loss, and the way kindness could feel like a lifeline when you were drowning. "Where do you live?" Frank asked. The woman blinked. What? "Where do you live?" he repeated, gentler this time, "because that wheelchair needs to be unloaded, and your groceries need to get inside, and—" He glanced at Lily, who was hugging her bear so tightly it looked like it might burst, "and I'd like to make sure you both get home safely." "You don't have to. I know I don't have to. But I'd like to, if that's okay with you." The woman stared at him, her eyes searching his face for something, malice, maybe, or pity, or some hidden agenda. Frank let her look. He had nothing to hide. He was just a tired single father who'd helped a struggling mother and gotten called daddy by a little girl who didn't know any better. And somehow, impossibly, it felt like the most important thing that had happened to him in 3 years. Finally, the woman nodded so subtly Frank almost missed it. Maple Street, Building 7, Apartment 3C. Frank opened the front passenger door and slid in beside the driver, who looked at him like he had lost his mind. "Maple Street, Building 7. I'll pay the fare." As the taxi pulled away from the parking lot, Frank glanced back through the partition. Lily had her nose pressed against the window now, watching the city lights blur past, while her mother sat rigid beside her, her hands twisted in her lap. And Frank realized, with a strange mixture of fear and certainty, that his life had just changed direction. He just didn't know how much. Not yet. The taxi wound through streets that grew progressively darker, the buildings more worn, the sidewalks more cracked. Frank watched the neighborhood transform through the windshield, recognizing the signs of a community forgotten by progress, boarded-up storefronts, flickering streetlights, clusters of people huddled under awnings despite the late hour. He'd lived in a place like this once after his wife died, before he'd clawed his way to something slightly better for Oliver's sake. The woman, she still hadn't told him her name, sat silent in the back seat, her reflection in the rearview mirror a study of tension. Lily had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, the stuffed bear tucked under her chin, her breathing soft and even. The innocence of it made Frank's chest ache. "Here," the woman said quietly as they approached a weather department complex. "This is it." The building loomed against the night sky, its brick facade stained with age and neglect. Several windows were dark, others glowed with the cold blue light of television screens. A broken playground sat in the courtyard, its swings hanging at odd angles like broken promises. Frank paid the driver, $15 he couldn't really spare, but he didn't hesitate, and climbed out. The woman was already trying to maneuver herself out of the back seat, careful not to wake Lily, her movements stiff with pain and pride. "Let me get the wheelchair first," Frank said, moving to the trunk. He lifted it out, unfolded it, checked that the wheels were locked. When he turned back, the woman had managed to slide to the edge of the seat, Lily still sleeping against her, dead weight in that boneless way children have. Her face was pale, a thin sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the cool evening air. "Can you take her?" the woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just for a moment while Of course." Frank leaned into the taxi and carefully scooped Lily into his arms. She was lighter than Oliver, all bird bones and fragile trust. She stirred slightly, her hand reaching out instinctively, finding the collar of his shirt and holding on. Her breath was warm against his neck. "Daddy," she mumbled in her sleep, and Frank felt something crack open inside his chest. He looked at the woman, really looked at her, and saw tears streaming silently down her face as she transferred herself to the wheelchair. She was trying to hide them, turning her face away, but her shoulders shook with the effort of containing her grief. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice fracturing. "I'm so sorry. You must think we're pathetic." "No," Frank said firmly, adjusting Lily in his arms. "I think you're doing your best, and I think your daughter is lucky to have a mother who fights as hard as you do." The woman's hands stilled on the wheelchair armrests. She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and Frank saw the exact moment her walls began to crack. "Grace," she said softly. "My name is Grace. Grace Morrison." Frank Stone. He shifted Lily carefully. "Let's get you both inside."
The journey to the third floor was a revelation in struggle. There was an elevator, but it was broken. Had been for months, according to the handwritten sign taped to its doors. Grace maneuvered her wheelchair to the stairwell, and Frank understood, with sinking horror, what she did every single day. She transferred out of the wheelchair, sitting on the bottom step, then used her arms to pull herself up backward, step by agonizing step, while Frank carried both Lily and the folded wheelchair. The groceries, mercifully, could be carried in multiple trips. By the second-floor landing, Grace was breathing hard, her arms trembling. By the third floor, she couldn't hide the tears anymore. "Grace," Frank said gently, setting down the wheelchair. "Let me help you." "I can do it," she insisted, but her voice was weak, her strength clearly depleted. "I know you can," Frank said, "but you don't have to. Not tonight." She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching, questioning. Then, slowly, she nodded. Frank handed Lily, still miraculously asleep, to Grace to hold for a moment, then crouched down. "Put your arms around my neck." Grace hesitated only a second before complying. Frank lifted her carefully, shocked by how little she weighed, and carried her up the remaining steps. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest, rapid and frightened, could feel the way she held herself rigid, unused to depending on anyone. When he set her down at the top of the stairs, she was crying openly now, no longer trying to hide it. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." Frank simply nodded, retrieving the wheelchair and helping her back into it. Then he followed her down the dimly lit hallway to apartment 3C. The door was old, the lock temperamental. Grace struggled with it one-handed while balancing Lily until Frank gently took the keys and opened it for her. The apartment beyond made his heart sink. It was clean, obsessively so, but devastatingly sparse. A threadbare couch sat in the tiny living room, its cushions sunken and worn. A small television on a rickety stand, a card table with two mismatched chairs. The walls were bare except for a few of Lily's crayon drawings taped up with care. But it was the details that gutted him. The buckets, strategically placed to catch leaks from the ceiling. The towels stuffed along the window frame where cold air whistled through gaps. The space heater in the corner, the only source of warmth, its cord frayed and dangerous. The kitchenette with its ancient appliances and single working burner. Grace wheeled herself inside, not meeting his eyes. "You can put her on the couch," she said quietly. "I'll move her to the bedroom once you leave." Frank laid Lily down carefully, tucking the stuffed bear beside her. The little girl curled around it instinctively, her thumb finding its way to her mouth. He should leave. He should go home to Oliver, to his own modest but comfortable apartment. He'd done enough, more than enough. But his feet wouldn't move. "Grace," he said slowly, looking at the buckets, the leaking ceiling, the wheelchair with its bent wheel. "How long have you been living like this?" Grace's hands tightened on the armrests. "It's fine. We're fine. That wheelchair is going to break completely soon. The elevator's been out for months. Your ceiling is—" "I said we're fine." Her voice was sharp now, defensive. "We don't need your pity. We don't need—" She stopped, her breath hitching. "You've done enough, please. Just go." Frank stood there, watching her crumble, watching her try to rebuild her walls even as they fell apart. He thought about Oliver, about how he'd felt after his wife died, drowning, desperate, too proud to ask for help even when he desperately needed it. He thought about the word Lily had whispered, "Daddy." And he thought about the empty spaces in his own life, the loneliness he'd learned to carry, the ache of being a single parent in a world that demanded you be superhuman just to survive. "What if," Frank said carefully, "we helped each other?" Grace looked up sharply. "What?" "I'm a single dad. My son is 7. I work double shifts at a diner and I'm barely keeping my head above water. I can't afford childcare, so my neighbor watches Oliver, but she's elderly and I worry about imposing. And Oliver, he misses having a mother. He misses having a family." Grace was staring at him like he was speaking another language. "You need help," Frank said bluntly. "You need someone to fix that wheelchair, to help you carry groceries, to navigate stairs, and Lily needs—" He glanced at the sleeping child. "She needs what all kids need. Stability, safety, maybe someone she can call daddy who won't disappear." "You don't know us," Grace whispered. "You don't know anything about us." "You're right," Frank agreed. "But I know what I saw tonight. I know that you're a mother who's fighting with everything she has. I know that Lily is loved even if you have nothing else to give her. And I know that sometimes the people who need each other most are strangers who meet in parking lots on random Tuesday nights." Grace's face crumpled. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this? What do you want from us?" Frank crouched down in front of her wheelchair, meeting her eyes directly. "I don't want anything," he said quietly. "Except maybe to stop feeling so alone. Except maybe to give my son a chance to be part of something bigger than just the two of us. Except maybe—" He paused, the words catching in his throat. "Except maybe to honor the memory of my wife by helping someone the way strangers helped us when she died. If someone offered to help you when you needed it most, would you have the courage to say yes? What would you do in Grace's position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments." The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Finally, Grace spoke. Her voice so soft Frank almost missed it. "Her name is Lily. She's 4 years old. She was born with cerebral palsy. Mild, but enough. And I was in a car accident 2 years ago. Spinal injury. Doctors said I'd never walk again. Her father left when he found out I was pregnant. Said he didn't sign up for a defective family." Frank felt rage flash through him, hot and righteous, but he kept his voice gentle. "He's an idiot." Grace laughed, a sharp, broken sound. "Maybe, but he was right about one thing. We are broken. I'm broken. My body doesn't work. I can't provide for my daughter the way she deserves. I can barely afford this apartment and it's falling apart. The social worker keeps threatening to take Lily away because of the conditions, but I don't have anywhere else to go. I'm trying so hard, but it's never enough. It's never—" Her voice dissolved into sobs, raw and devastating. Frank didn't think. He just reached out and took her hand. Grace's fingers clutched his like a lifeline, like she was drowning and he was the only solid thing in a churning sea. They stayed like that, two strangers connected by grief and hope, and the sleeping child between them. "Let me help," Frank said again. "Please, let me help." Grace looked at their joined hands, then at Lily, then back at Frank's face. Whatever she saw there, honesty, desperation, a reflection of her own loneliness, it was enough. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Frank came back the next morning with tools, spare parts for the wheelchair, and Oliver in tow. His son stood in the doorway of apartment 3C, clutching his father's hand, his eyes wide with curiosity and uncertainty. Oliver had his mother's features, delicate and thoughtful, but Frank's dark hair and serious expression. He was small for 7, often mistaken for younger, which Frank knew bothered him. "This is Oliver," Frank introduced, giving his son's hand an encouraging squeeze. "Oliver, this is Miss Grace and her daughter Lily." Grace had positioned herself by the window, morning light illuminating the exhaustion etched into her features. She'd clearly been up all night, probably second-guessing her decision to accept help from a stranger, but she smiled at Oliver, genuine and warm. "Hello, Oliver.
It's very nice to meet you. Oliver ducked his head shyly, pressing closer to his father's leg. Hi. Lily was awake now, sitting on the couch with her stuffed bear, watching Oliver with intense interest. She was wearing mismatched pajamas, one pink sleeve, one purple, and her hair stood up in wild tufts that suggested Grace had struggled with the morning routine. That's your boy? Lily asked, pointing at Oliver with her bear's paw. That's my son, Frank confirmed. Lily's face lit up. I never had a brother before. Lily. Grace started, but Lily was already sliding off the couch, dragging her bear toward Oliver. You want to see my drawings? I drawed a unicorn. It's purple. Mommy says purple unicorns aren't real, but I think they are. Do you think they're real? Oliver looked at his father, uncertain, then back at Lily. Slowly, he nodded. I think they're real. Lily beamed. I knew it! Come on! She grabbed Oliver's free hand and tugged him toward the corner where her art supplies, a handful of broken crayons and scraps of paper, were carefully organized. Oliver went willingly, and Frank felt something loosen in his chest at the sight of his son, usually so solemn, smiling at this exuberant little girl. I'm sorry, Grace said, watching the children. She's very enthusiastic. Don't apologize, Frank said. Oliver needs enthusiastic. He's been too serious since his mother died. Grace met his eyes, understanding passing between them. They were both trying to be enough for their children while drowning in their own grief. So, Frank said, pulling himself back to the present, let me look at that wheelchair. Over the next hour, Frank worked, while Grace watched, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. The bent wheel couldn't be fully straightened, but he managed to reinforce it enough to function safely. He tightened loose bolts, oiled squeaking joints, replaced the frayed seatbelt with one he'd bought on the way over. Where did you learn to do this? Grace asked as he worked. Necessity. When my wife got sick, I learned to maintain her wheelchair, her hospital bed, all the equipment. After she died, I couldn't afford to pay people to fix things, so I taught myself. YouTube videos are surprisingly helpful. Grace laughed softly, and Frank realized it was the first time he'd heard her laugh without pain behind it. While he worked, they talked. Carefully at first, then more freely. Grace told him about her life before the accident. She had been a teacher, kindergarten, dreaming of eventually becoming a principal. She told him about the drunk driver who'd run a red light, the months of hospital bills, the way her savings had evaporated overnight. She told him about the father who had sent one text message, I can't do this. I'm sorry, and vanished. Frank told him about his wife, Sarah, about how cancer had taken her in 8 brutal months, about the medical debt he was still paying off, about the night shifts and double shifts and the constant exhaustion of trying to be both mother and father to a grieving boy. Sometimes I'm so tired I can't see straight, Frank admitted, tightening the last bolt. But then Oliver looks at me with these big eyes, asking if I'm okay, and I realize he's taking care of me. A 7-year-old shouldn't have to do that. A 4-year-old shouldn't call strangers daddy because she's never had a father, Grace countered quietly. I guess we're both failing in creative ways. Or, Frank said, sitting back on his heels, we're both surviving the best way we know how, and maybe that's enough. Grace looked at him for a long moment. You're different than I expected. What did you expect? I don't know. Someone who'd want something. Who'd help once and then expect, I don't know, gratitude, repayment, something. Frank understood. The world had taught her to expect nothing good without a price. I just want to help, he said simply. No strings, no expectations, just help. Grace's eyes filled with tears again, but she blinked them back. I don't know how to accept that. Neither did I, Frank said, until someone forced me to. After Sarah died, my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, the one who watches Oliver, she just started showing up, bringing food, watching Oliver, not asking, just doing. I tried to refuse at first, but she told me something I've never forgotten. What? She said, everyone needs help sometimes. The strongest thing you can do is let people care about you. So I let her help, and it saved my life. Now I'm asking you to do the same. Let me help. Let us help. From the corner, Lily's voice rang out. Ollie drawed a purple unicorn. Look, Mommy, it has wings and a horn. Both adults turned to see Oliver holding up a crayon drawing, his face flushed with pride, while Lily bounced excitedly beside him. Oliver never drew for strangers. He barely drew any more at all. Grace's hand flew to her mouth, a sob caught in her throat.
He let her call him Oli, she whispered. He never in an hour She couldn't finish. Frank felt his own throat tighten. Kids know things adults forget. They know who's safe, who's kind. He stood, testing the wheelchair. It rolled smoothly now, all four wheels aligned, brakes functioning properly. Try it. Grace wheeled herself forward, then back, then in a circle. The bent wheel still wobbled slightly, but it held. It's perfect, she breathed. Thank you so much. It's a start, Frank said. Now, about that ceiling. Over the following days, Frank became a fixture in apartment 3C. He came after his morning shifts with supplies salvaged from hardware store discount bins and his own toolkit. He patched the leaking ceiling with weatherproofing sealant, he stuffed insulation into the window gaps, he replaced the dangerous space heater cord, he installed a grab bar in the bathroom to help Grace transfer more safely. And slowly, carefully, something began to grow between them. Grace started smiling more, the permanent tension in her shoulders easing. She began to trust that Frank would show up when he said he would, that he wouldn't ask for anything in return, that his kindness wasn't a transaction waiting to be collected. Oliver and Lily became inseparable. Oliver taught Lily to count to 20. Lily taught Oliver that it was okay to be silly, to laugh too loud, to draw outside the lines. They played together for hours while Frank worked and Grace watched, her heart gradually healing in ways she hadn't thought possible. One evening, after Frank had finished installing a sturdy shelf for Lily's books, donated from Oliver's collection, Grace made dinner. It was simple, pasta with jar sauce, garlic bread. But they ate together at the card table, four people who had been alone suddenly feeling like something more. "This is nice," Oliver said softly, twirling spaghetti on his fork. "I forgot what it's like to eat with other people." Lily nodded vigorously, her face covered in sauce. "We're like a family." The adults froze. Frank and Grace locked eyes across the table, both afraid to breathe, afraid to name what was happening between them. "Yeah, we are like a family," Oliver said, oblivious to the adults' tension. "We are like a family." After dinner, while the kids watched a movie on Grace's old television, Frank helped wash dishes in the tiny kitchenette. They worked in comfortable silence, his washing, her drying, moving around each other in the cramped space with an ease that felt natural, inevitable. "Frank," Grace said quietly, setting down a plate, "can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Why are you really doing this?" Her voice was vulnerable, afraid. "And please don't say it's just kindness. People aren't this kind without reason." Frank was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling in the soapy water. "Do you believe in signs?" "What?" "Signs. From the universe or God or whatever you believe in?" He pulled his hands from the water, drying them on a towel. 3 years ago, my wife died, and I was so angry. Angry at the world, at God, at myself for not being able to save her. I stopped believing in anything good. Grace listened, not interrupting. But then on the 3-year anniversary of her death, which was last Tuesday, I asked her for a sign. I know that sounds crazy, but I did. I asked her to show me that I was doing okay, that Oliver was going to be okay, that there was still good in the world worth fighting for. He met Grace's eyes. "And then I saw you in that parking lot, and Lily called me Daddy. And I knew." "Knew what?" Grace whispered. "That maybe I was the sign. That maybe Sarah sent me to you or you to me because we both needed to remember that we're not alone, that there are still people worth fighting for." A tear slipped down Grace's cheek. "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you. Neither of us deserves what happened to us, but maybe we deserve a second chance at happiness. Maybe our kids deserve to see their parents smile again. Maybe—" He hesitated, but then pushed forward. "Maybe we deserve each other." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and honest. Grace opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Oliver's voice called from the living room. "Dad, Lily fell asleep on me." They both turned to see Oliver sitting very still on the couch, Lily curled against his side, her bear clutched in her arms, fast asleep. Oliver looked proud and protective and terrified to move.
Frank and Grace laughed, the tension breaking like a dam, and in that laughter was the sound of two people beginning to heal. 2 weeks passed in a blur of ordinary moments that felt extraordinary. Frank and Oliver spent more evenings at apartment 3C than at their own place. Grace started cooking dinner for all of them, finding joy in meal planning and the simple act of feeding people she cared about. The children played endlessly, their laughter filling spaces that had been silent for too long. But reality, as it always does, came crashing back. Frank was carrying groceries up the stairs to Grace's apartment on a Friday evening when he encountered a woman in a gray suit standing outside 3C. She was tall, severe-looking, with a clipboard and an expression that Frank recognized immediately. A social worker. His stomach dropped. "Can I help you?" he asked carefully, setting down the grocery bags. The woman turned, assessing him with sharp eyes. "I'm looking for Grace Morrison. Are you a relative?" "A friend," Frank said, because what else could he call himself? "Miss Morrison missed her appointment with Child Protective Services this week. This is her second missed appointment. We need to conduct a home visit to assess the living conditions for the minor child in her care." Frank's mind raced. Grace hadn't mentioned an appointment. Had she forgotten? Or had she been too afraid to tell him?
"I'm sure there's an explanation," Frank said. "Can I—" The door opened and Grace appeared, her face draining of color when she saw the social worker. Lily peeked out from behind her mother's wheelchair, her earlier smile vanishing. "Miss Morrison," the social worker said, her voice professionally neutral. "I'm Diane Foster from CPS. We need to talk." What followed was a nightmare in slow motion. Miss Foster entered the apartment with the practiced eye of someone looking for problems. She noted the patched ceiling, better but still visible water damage. She photographed the space heater, new cord, but still the primary heat source. She documented the cramped quarters, the makeshift shelving, the bathroom's lack of proper accessibility modifications beyond the single grab bar Frank had installed. Grace sat rigid in her wheelchair, her hands trembling, while Lily clung to her mother's lap. Oliver stood close to Frank, confused and frightened by the official scrutiny. "Ms. Morrison," Miss Foster said, closing her notebook, "I appreciate that improvements have been made since our last visit. However, this apartment still does not meet the minimum standards for adequate housing for a disabled parent and special needs child. The building's elevator has been non-functional for 4 months. You're 3 floors up with no reliable means of evacuation in case of emergency. The heating system is insufficient. I'm doing my best," Grace interrupted, her voice breaking. "I know it's not perfect, but Lily is loved, she's fed, she's safe, she's happy." "Love isn't sufficient," Miss Foster said, not unkindly. "A child needs stability, safety, proper housing. You're barely making rent here. You have no family support, no sustainable childcare arrangements. You missed physical therapy appointments because you can't afford the copays. And now you've missed 2 meetings with us." "I forgot. With everything happening, I forgot." Miss Foster's expression softened slightly. "Ms. Morrison, I'm not the enemy. I want what's best for Lily. But I have serious concerns about whether you can adequately provide for her given your current circumstances." "What does that mean?" Frank asked, though he already knew. He could see it in Miss Foster's eyes. "It means," the social worker said carefully, "that I'm required to file a report recommending that Lily be placed in temporary foster care, while Miss Morrison works to secure appropriate housing and support services." "No!" The word came out as a sob from Grace. "No, please. She's all I have. I can fix this. I can find another apartment. I can—" "With what income?" Miss Foster asked gently. "You're on disability assistance, which barely covers your current rent. There are waiting lists for accessible housing that are years long. I understand this is difficult, but—" "She's not taking my daughter." Grace's voice was steel wrapped in terror. "I won't let you. Ms. Morrison, I'm trying to help." "Then help me keep my child." Grace was crying now, her whole body shaking. "We're doing okay. Mommy!" Lily's voice cut through the rising panic. "Why are you crying?" Grace pulled Lily close, burying her face in her daughter's hair. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's okay." But she wasn't okay. Frank could see her falling apart, could see the terror of losing the one thing that kept her going. He thought about Oliver, about how he'd felt in those awful months after Sarah died when he'd nearly lost everything. He thought about the emptiness that came from loving someone and not being able to protect them. And he made a decision. What if she wasn't alone? Frank heard himself say. Everyone turned to look at him. What if Grace had family support? Frank continued, his heart pounding. What if she had adequate housing, financial stability, someone to help with Lily's care? Miss Foster frowned.
Do you have family willing to help, Miss Morrison? No, I don't have... She has me, Frank said firmly. He moved to stand beside Grace's wheelchair, placing a hand on her shoulder. I'm Frank Stone. He hesitated for only a moment. I'm Grace's partner. We're together. We're planning to move in together, combine our households, share expenses. I have stable employment and a suitable apartment with an elevator. Oliver is in a good school. There's room for all of us. Grace's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. Frank, what do you... He squeezed her shoulder gently, urgently. Trust me. Miss Foster looked between them skeptically. This is the first I'm hearing of a partner, Ms. Morrison. When did this relationship begin? Recently, Frank said before Grace could speak. We met a few weeks ago. I know it seems fast, but when you find the right person... He looked down at Grace, his eyes pleading with her to go along with this. When you find the right person, you know. And Oliver and Lily get along wonderfully. We're already practically living together. Is this true, Miss Morrison? Grace stared up at Frank, her eyes swimming with tears and questions and something that might have been hope. She could see her weighing the lie against losing her daughter, could see her trying to understand what he was offering and what it would cost. Yes, Grace finally whispered. It's true. Miss Foster studied them both for a long moment. I'll need to verify this. I'll need to see Mr. Stone's apartment, his employment records, his background check. I'll need proof that this is a legitimate relationship and living arrangement, not a temporary solution to avoid removal. You'll have it, Frank said. All of it. Whatever you need. And you understand, Miss Foster said, directing this at Frank, that you would be taking on legal responsibility for a special needs child. That's not something to enter into lightly. Frank thought about Lily calling him Daddy, about the way she'd fallen asleep against Oliver, about the purple unicorn drawings taped to his refrigerator at home, about the way Grace had started to smile again, the way she'd taught Oliver to laugh. I understand, he said, and I'm ready.
Miss Foster made several notes, her expression unreadable. Finally, she stood. I'm going to give you 2 weeks. 2 weeks to prove that this living arrangement is stable and appropriate. I'll schedule a home visit to Mr. Stone's residence. If everything checks out, if this is legitimate and sustainable, then we can close this case. But if I find out this is a fabrication, or if the situation deteriorates, I will have no choice but to move forward with removal. Do you both understand? Yes, they said in unison. 2 weeks, Miss Morrison. Don't make me regret this. After Miss Foster left, the apartment fell into ringing silence. Oliver had taken Lily into the bedroom to play, giving the adults space, but Frank could hear their soft voices through the thin walls, Oliver reading a story, Lily asking questions about whether the princess would be okay. Grace sat motionless in her wheelchair, staring at nothing. Grace, Frank said softly, kneeling beside her. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have spoken for you. I couldn't let them take her. I couldn't... Why? Grace interrupted, her voice hollow. Why would you do that? You barely know us. You don't owe us anything. Now you've lied to a social worker, put yourself at risk, promised things you can't possibly want to deliver. What if I do want to deliver them? Grace finally looked at him, her eyes red and exhausted. Don't say things you don't mean, not about this, not about Lily. I've never meant anything more in my life, Frank said. He took her hands in his, holding tight when she tried to pull away. Grace, I know this is fast. I know it's crazy, but these past 2 weeks have been the happiest I've been since Sarah died. Oliver is happy, Lily is happy, and you... He touched her face gently, wiping away a tear with his thumb. You make me believe in good things again, in family, in the possibility of not being alone anymore. You want us to move in together because of a social worker? Grace asked, but there was something desperate in her voice, something that wanted to believe. No, Frank said, I want you to move in with us because I'm falling in love with you, because Oliver loves Lily like a sister, because we work together in ways I didn't think were possible anymore. The social worker just gave me the courage to say it out loud. Grace was crying harder now, her whole body shaking. I'm broken, Frank. My body doesn't work. I can't give you. You're not broken, Frank said fiercely. You're strong and beautiful and an amazing mother. Your body not working the way society expects doesn't make you less. It makes you human, and I don't care about any of that. I care about you, about who you are, not what you can or can't do physically. What if it doesn't work? Grace whispered. What if we move in together and it's a disaster, and then Lily loses everything? What if it does work? Frank countered. What if we build something beautiful? What if we give our kids the family they've been missing? What if we save each other?
Grace looked at him for a long time, searching his face for doubt or deception or the inevitable disappointment she'd learned to expect. But Frank held steady, letting her see everything, his fear, his hope, his absolute certainty that this was right. "Okay," Grace finally breathed. "Okay, let's try." Frank felt relief crash over him like a wave. He pulled Grace into his arms, and she clutched him back, both of them holding on like drowning people who'd finally found shore. From the bedroom, Lily's voice called out, "Mommy! Ollie says we're going to be a real family. Is that true?" Grace laughed through her tears, the sound watery but genuine. "Yeah, baby, I think it is." Frank pulled back just enough to see her face. "We should tell them properly, together." They went to the bedroom, Frank walking, Grace wheeling beside him, and found Oliver and Lily sitting on the floor surrounded by books. Both children looked up, their faces anxious. "Are you still sad, Mommy?" "No, sweet girl," Grace said, opening her arms. Lily scrambled into her lap. "Mommy's not sad anymore." Oliver looked at his father. "Dad, what's happening?" Frank sat down on the floor, pulling Oliver close. "How would you feel about Lily and Miss Grace coming to live with us, permanently?" Oliver's eyes went wide. "Really? Like forever?" "Like forever," Frank confirmed. "Would they be my family? For real?" Grace reached out and took Oliver's hand. "If you want us to be." Oliver looked at Lily, who was bouncing excitedly in Grace's lap, then at his father, then at Grace. Frank could see him processing, weighing, hoping. "I want that," Oliver said softly. "I want a family again." "Me too," Lily shouted, "and Ollie can be my brother, and Daddy can be my daddy, and Mommy can be Ollie's mommy, and we'll all be together forever and ever." She said it so simply, with such absolute faith, that the adults couldn't do anything but laugh and cry and hold their children close. Have you ever had to make a leap of faith for someone you loved? What would you sacrifice to keep a family together? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the bravest thing we do is choose to trust. That night, after the children had finally fallen asleep, Lily in Grace's bed, Oliver on the couch, Frank and Grace sat in the kitchen stone-making plans. "We'll move everyone into my apartment next week," Frank said, scribbling notes on a piece of paper. "It's bigger and the building has an elevator. I'll need to rearrange furniture, but Oliver and Lily can share a room. You can have the second bedroom, and I'll take the couch until, unless you want different arrangements." Grace was quiet for a moment. "Frank, you don't have to sleep on the couch in your own home. We're adults. We can share a room. I trust you." Frank looked up, meeting her eyes. "Are you sure?"
"I'm sure about you," Grace said softly. "Everything else we'll figure out together." "Together," Frank repeated, and the word felt like a promise. They talked late into the night, about logistics, about finances, about how to combine two broken families into something whole. They talked about Grace's physical therapy, about Lily's medical appointments, about Oliver's school schedule. They talked about the hard things and the scary things, and the things neither of them knew how to handle yet. And underneath it all was the unspoken truth. They were both terrified. Terrified of failing, terrified of letting down the children who needed them, terrified of this fragile, impossible thing they were building. But they were also hopeful, and hope, Frank was learning, was sometimes enough to build a life on. The move happened on a Sunday, with Mrs. Patterson coordinating from Frank's apartment, while Frank, Grace, and a borrowed truck shuttled belongings from 3C to their new home. It wasn't much. Grace had accumulated very little in her years of struggling, but each box represented something precious. Lily's drawings, Grace's teaching books from before the accident, the few photographs she had of herself pregnant, glowing with hope before the world had broken her. Oliver and Lily helped by running between rooms announcing each new discovery in Frank's apartment with breathless excitement. "There's a bathtub, a big one," Lily shouted. "The elevator has buttons," Oliver called. "I can push them. The kitchen has 2 sinks. There's a park across the street." Their joy was infectious, transforming the exhausting work of moving into something celebratory. Mrs. Patterson had prepared a feast, lasagna, garlic bread, salad, and a chocolate cake she'd baked that morning. When everyone finally collapsed around Frank's dining table, sweaty and exhausted, she raised a glass of sparkling cider. "To new beginnings," she said, her eyes twinkling with approval. "And to family, however we find it." "To family," they echoed, clinking glasses. Lily insisted on sitting between Oliver and Frank, while Grace positioned her wheelchair at the head of the table, looking more relaxed than Frank had ever seen her.
The apartment was chaotic, boxes everywhere, furniture in wrong places, nothing quite settled, but it felt alive in a way it hadn't since Sarah died. After dinner, while Mrs. Patterson kept the children occupied with a movie, Frank showed Grace the bedroom they'd be sharing. He'd moved his furniture to make space for her things, installed handles by the bed to help with transfers, made sure there was a clear path from the door to the bathroom. "You thought of everything," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "I tried. We can adjust things as we go. If something doesn't work, we'll figure it out." Grace wheeled over to the window, looking out at the park across the street where Oliver and Lily would play. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and this will all be a dream, that I'll be back in 3C with the leaking ceiling and the broken elevator, trying to convince myself that it's enough." Frank moved to stand beside her. "This is real. We're real." "I know," Grace said. "That's what scares me. What if I'm not enough? What if you realize you made a mistake?" Frank knelt down so they were eye level. "Grace Morrison, listen to me. You are extraordinary. You survived things that would have destroyed most people. You raised Lily alone with no support and made her feel loved every single day. You taught yourself to navigate a world that isn't built for wheelchairs. You never gave up even when you had every reason to. If anyone's not enough here, it's me. But I'm going to spend every day trying to be worthy of the trust you're placing in me." Grace touched his face, her fingers trembling. "How are you real?" "I could ask you the same thing." They stayed like that for a long moment, two people who'd been alone, learning what it meant to be together. The next week was a whirlwind of adjustments. Mornings were chaos. Getting 4 people ready and out the door required military precision. Frank learned Grace's morning routine, how to help without hovering, when to offer assistance and when to step back. Grace learned to accept help without feeling like a burden. Oliver and Lily adapted with the resilience of children. They shared a room without complaint, inventing elaborate games that involved building blanket forts and telling stories until Frank had to come separate them at bedtime. Oliver became fiercely protective of Lily, holding her hand when they crossed streets, reading to her before bed, explaining things with the patience of a much older child. And Lily, in turn, taught Oliver to be silly again. She made him laugh until soda came out his nose. She convinced him to finger paint, to sing made-up songs, to dance in the living room. She called him Ollie Bear and insisted on goodnight hugs that lasted forever. And gradually, Lily started calling Frank Daddy, not by mistake, but by choice. The first time it happened, when she ran to him after preschool, arms outstretched, shouting, "Daddy, I made you a picture!" Frank had to turn away to hide his tears. Grace had squeezed his hand. "She means it now," she whispered. "You know that, right?" "I know," Frank had managed. "I know." When Miss Foster came for the home inspection 10 days later, she found a functioning family. The apartment was clean and organized. The children's room was filled with toys and books and evidence of love. Grace had appointments scheduled for all of Lily's medical needs. Frank's employment was verified, his background check clean. But more than the logistics, Mrs. Foster saw the way Oliver automatically helped Lily with her coat, the way Grace and Frank moved around each other in the kitstone with practiced ease, the way Lily called them Daddy and Mommy without hesitation, the way they all sat down to dinner together, holding hands for Grace, talking and laughing like they'd been a family forever. "Well," Mrs. Foster said, closing her folder, "I have to admit I had my doubts. But this," she gestured around the apartment, "this is real. You've built something good here." "Does that mean—" Grace couldn't finish, afraid to hope. "It means," Mrs. Foster said with a small smile, "that I'm closing your case. Lily is in a safe, stable, loving home. That's all we ever want for the children we serve." After she left, Grace broke down completely, sobbing with relief and joy and the release of weeks of terror. Frank held her while the children hugged them both, not understanding everything, but understanding enough.
3 months later, Frank came home from his shift to find Grace in the kitstone teaching Oliver and Lily how to make cookies. Flour dusted every surface. Lily had chocolate on her face. Oliver was concentrating fiercely on cutting shapes from the dough. "We're making cookies for Mrs. Patterson," Lily announced, "'cause she helped us when we needed help." "That's very thoughtful," Frank said, kissing the top of her head, then Oliver's, then finally Grace's, letting his lips linger. Grace smiled up at him, her eyes warm. "There's something else we need to talk about," she said softly, once the children were distracted with decorating. "I got a call today from the school district. They have an opening for a part-time adaptive education specialist. It's work I can do from home, developing curriculum for special needs students. It's not much money, but—" "Grace, that's amazing!" Frank pulled her close. "You'll be teaching again. That's what you always wanted." "Part of what I wanted," Grace corrected, wrapping her arms around his waist. "The other part was this: family, home, belonging." Frank rested his chin on her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, listening to their children argue lovingly about whether cookies should have sprinkles or chocolate chips. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about making this official." Grace pulled back to look at him. "Official?" "Getting married," Frank clarified, his heart pounding. "I know it's fast. I know we've only been together a few months, but it feels right, Grace, us. This family. I want to make it permanent. I want to adopt Lily legally. I want Oliver to have your last name if he wants it. I want—" "Yes," Grace interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Frank. Yes to all of it." They kissed, while Lily cheered and Oliver made exaggerated gagging sounds, and somewhere in the chaos of cookie dough and children's laughter, two broken people became whole. 6 months later. The courthouse was small and intimate, filled with the people who mattered most. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row, beaming. A few co-workers from the diner. Grace's physical therapist, who'd become a friend. Oliver's teacher, who had watched him transform from a quiet, sad child into one who smiled every day. Oliver stood beside Frank in a suit that was slightly too big, his hair combed neatly, holding the rings in a small pillow. Lily sat in Grace's lap, wearing a princess dress she had picked out herself, holding a bouquet of daisies almost as big as she was. When the judge asked if anyone objected to the marriage, Lily shouted, "No, we want to be a family!" Everyone laughed, and the judge, a kind woman with gray hair, smiled down at her. "Well, that's quite an endorsement. Do you, Frank Stone, take Grace Morrison to be your wife?" "I do," Frank said, his voice steady, despite the tears in his eyes. "And do you, Grace Morrison, take Frank Stone to be your husband?" "I do," Grace whispered. "Then, by the power vested in me by the state, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Frank leaned down, cupping Grace's face, and kissed her gently while Lily squealed and Oliver made exaggerated gagging sounds, and Mrs. Patterson wept happy tears into her handkerchief. But the ceremony wasn't over. "We have one more piece of business," the judge said, looking at Frank and Grace. "I understand there's an adoption petition." Frank nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The judge smiled at Lily. "Young lady, Mr. Stone would like to become your legal father. Do you know what that means?" Lily nodded solemnly. "It means he's my daddy forever and ever, and he can't go away." "That's exactly right. And it also means that Oliver would be your legal brother. How do you feel about that?" "I love Ollie," she said simply. "He's the best brother in the whole world." Oliver ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased. "Well then," the judge said, signing the papers with a flourish, "Frank Stone, you are now legally the father of Lily Morrison Stone. Congratulations to all of you." Frank lifted Lily from Grace's lap, holding her close as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "Daddy," she whispered into his ear, and this time there was no mistake, no confusion, just truth. "My little girl," Frank whispered back. "Forever." Grace reached up to take Frank's hand, pulling both him and Lily close, while Oliver pressed against them, creating a knot of arms and hearts and belonging. They took photos on the courthouse steps, an unconventional family formed from loss and chance, and a single act of kindness in a parking lot. Frank in his suit, Grace in her wheelchair wearing a simple white dress, Oliver and Lily holding a sign that said, "Finally a family," that they had made together. That evening, back at home, they had a celebration dinner with Mrs. Patterson and their small circle of friends. The apartment was too crowded, too loud, too full of love. Lily insisted on making a speech, a rambling, adorable monologue about purple unicorns and how families are made of love, not blood, that had everyone laughing and crying. Later, after the guests had left and the children were finally in bed, Frank and Grace sat on their small balcony looking out at the city lights.
Grace was in her wheelchair, Frank in a chair pulled close, their hands intertwined. "Do you remember," Grace said softly, "that first night in the parking lot?" "I said a lot of things," Frank replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "You said, 'Let me help,'" Grace recalled. "Such simple words, but they changed everything." "You changed everything," Frank corrected. "You and Lily. You taught me that it's possible to love again, to build again, to hope again." Grace turned to look at him, the city lights reflected in her eyes. "I was drowning before you found us. Literally drowning. I'd given up. I was just going through the motions, waiting for the moment when it would all fall apart and they'd take Lily away. I couldn't see any way forward." "And now?" Frank asked. "Now I have everything," Grace said simply. "A husband who loves me, a son who makes me laugh, a daughter who knows she'll never be abandoned, a future that looks bright instead of terrifying." How did we get so lucky? I don't think it was luck. I think it was meant to be. Sarah used to say that the universe conspires to help people who refuse to give up. You never gave up on Lily. I never gave up on Oliver. And somehow, impossibly, we found each other. "Thank you, Daddy," a small voice said from the doorway. They both turned to see Lily standing there in her nightgown, clutching her stuffed bear, looking impossibly small and precious.
"Baby, you're supposed to be asleep," Grace said gently. "I know," Lily said, padding over to them, "but I wanted to say thank you to Daddy for making us a family, for being the daddy I wished for." Frank lifted her onto his lap, wrapping his arms around her. "You don't have to thank me, sweet girl. You gave me the greatest gift. You called me Daddy when I needed to remember what that meant. You saved me just as much as I saved you." Lily considered this seriously. "So we saved each other?" "Exactly," Grace said, wheeling closer so she could touch both of them. "We all saved each other." Lily yawned, settling more deeply into Frank's embrace. "Good. That's how families work." From inside, they heard Oliver's voice calling sleepily, "Lily, where'd you go?" "We should get her back to bed," Grace said. But Frank held on for just a moment longer, looking at his wife, at his daughter, at the life they'd built from broken pieces and desperate hope. "I love you," he said to both of them. "So much." "We love you too, Daddy," Lily murmured, already half asleep. Grace reached out and the three of them held hands, father, mother, daughter, a constellation of love that had formed from darkness and mercy and the simple human need to not be alone. Later, much later, after Lily had been tucked back into bed beside Oliver, after Grace and Frank had finally collapsed into their own bed, exhausted but happy, Grace whispered into the darkness, "Do you think we'll always be this happy?" Frank pulled her closer, his heart full. "I think we'll have hard days. I think we'll struggle and fight and worry. I think raising 2 kids while navigating your disability and my work schedule and all of life's complications will be exhausting and frustrating and sometimes overwhelming." "That's not very reassuring," Grace said, but he could hear the smile in her voice. "But," Frank continued, "I also think that every hard day will be easier because we're facing it together. I think our love is strong enough to weather whatever comes, and I think that 20 years from now, we'll look back on this moment and realize it was just the beginning of something beautiful." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I think you're right. I think we're going to be okay." "Better than okay," Frank promised. "We're going to be extraordinary." And in the next room, 2 children who'd been lonely and afraid slept peacefully, dreaming of purple unicorns and families that never left, held safe by the knowledge that they were loved. Because sometimes miracles happen in parking lots. Sometimes broken people find each other and become whole. Sometimes a single act of kindness ripples outward, transforming not just one life, but 4. And sometimes, just sometimes, when a little girl calls a stranger daddy, it's not a mistake at all. It's destiny recognizing itself. What's one act of kindness that changed your life? How do you define family? By blood or by love?
Leave a comment sharing your story. You never know who might need to hear it today. And if this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances.